So, hi everyone. I'm here with Ken Doherty today, who's from Cerebreon, and he's the CTO. And Cerebreon are in the sort of like the data analytics, software analytics kind of
Yeah,
space, debt
particularly.
recovery, and the insolvency space in particular. So Ken, thanks very much for joining me today. I appreciate you joining, really.
No, Chris, listen, thanks for having me part of the series.
And I suppose part of my immediate questions. We'll get onto some of the analytics a little bit later, but part of my immediate questions were around things like AI and modeling and some of the analytics, and we've seen this huge sort of like increase in the amount of a focus there has really been on analytics, really grown by data. But are you sort of starting to see that changing? And particularly, there's been a lot of noise made around AI and AI techniques. I mean, but are you sort of seeing that sort of like maturing? I mean, what's your current view kind of that kind of interest in industry?
Yeah, so yeah, it is a really good topic. Yeah, I guess for me, maybe before we start, just my interpretation, I guess I probably have a wee bit of a gripe about the use or the misuse of AI. It's a very, very broad brush in
Hmm.
capturing, and I guess it's a good buzzword. A lot of salespeople can use it to spice up their product. But for me, AI, the proper artificial intelligence, is really, as it says, the machine doesn't, it can think for itself. So it's really that unsupervised learning. It's kind of maybe constrained more to the sort of robotics. If you just think of the robotics and the sci-fi stuff, for
Hmm.
me, that's what the term and the branding AI should be used for. And
Hmm.
then the other segment is the machine learning. And for me, I probably wouldn't classify that as artificial intelligence because it's just a machine that's been well trained by humans to, to look for patterns and stuff. Very powerful, don't get me wrong. So I guess if we segment it in those two parts, I kind of feel the AI, the robotics, that sort of new age, the stuff that Tesla, the Googles, the Amazons of the world, I really think that we're only starting to see the tip of the iceberg there. I think
Hmm.
that is going to innovate, that is going to get bigger, better. I think our minds are going to be blown with what can happen. Um, it's probably isolated to those big players though, because it's getting more and more expensive to make any advancements in it.
Hmm.
It's not for the small companies on the high street.
And I suppose for machine learning, I mean, there's a lot, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, like a lot of this modeling technique's been around for the longest time, hasn't it? I mean, even back since the 70s. And what's really changed has been the amount of data that we can now store, I think,
Yeah.
is number one, and then the processing power to then be able to process that and using techniques such as neural networks, which I think they were invented in the 70s, weren't they?
Well,
I mean,
I think so, and it goes back even further. I think a lot of the techniques that the machine learning is based on, the mathematics was all kind of figured out in the 1930s and 40s, and
the 30s and 40s.
it sort of it sort of lay on the shelves there because no one could really do anything with it because you couldn't compute what you needed. So just the advent of of technology has now
Yeah.
brought this to life, and so as a society, we're getting to experience firsthand what it can deliver, but it's not new. And so I guess people selling it as a new thing can be a little bit misleading at times.
Down a little bit. Yeah. There seems like there's more realism
Mm,
around machine learning now, and
correct.
people understand it as machine learning. I mean, but there's still the search out there really for use cases, right? Which is sort of been really sort of the Achilles heel of it. It's like, what do I do with it? So there's some great stuff I can do, but what do I actually do with it, and what kind of problems do I solve?
Yeah, listen, I think simple is better. Always start with that. There's a lot of
Hmm.
nice machine learning techniques, and I don't know, people like to rush for the neural networks. I think it sounds fancier and stuff.
Sounds good, yeah.
But yeah, like start simple. Start your foundation just a step up, just some good statistical analysis, you could say a bit more traditional mathematics, and then go into the
Hmm.
early stages of machine learning, some of those models. Really, I find the simpler the machine learning model, if a company or an individual is on that journey, you can actually understand what it's doing. You can, as a human, interpret what it's doing. The more and more
Hmm.
complex you get, it gets a bit more black box, and that
Hmm.
then brings with it, a lot of perils along the way because if you don't understand the assumptions behind the mathematics or the fundamentals behind it, it's easy to
Hmm.
misuse. And I guess that's the one thing, technology and the advent of bringing machine learning to life has brought this accessible to companies. And as you say, sorry, the challenge is the use cases,
Hmm.
but it has also brought the ability to misuse it quite badly.
Hmm.
And the machine will always give you an answer. And sometimes the problem then is how humans interpret that answer. Sometimes you want to find the answer that you you were
Yeah.
looking for in the first place. But how they approach it, um, I guess, don't think that you need to go all singing, all dancing. You have to have the most elegant machine learning approach for you to win and use it in your
Mm.
company. Start very simple with some of the most basic techniques and build it up. And if it works, it's always just going to be a means to an end. It's just another tool in your toolkit, to either
Mm.
run your business or find some insights. And if you can do
Mm.
that simpler, then always go to that.
Leads into, I mean, there's definitely been got a lot of focus, certainly here in the UK from the FCA around transparency of decision
Mm,
making. I
mm,
know in the US there's been that for a while actually around transparency of decision making and lending. And in the background, we've got the EU AI Act that's coming out as well, which again is talking about transparency. It talks around sort of like making sure you can understand how. I mean, do you sort of see like the regulator? It's almost like the regulations haven't kept up with the technology, but it's almost like it feels like they're starting to catch up now.
yeah, I think also that's very true, and I guess that's true with any kind of regulation. The technology always advances quicker. There's
Mm,
probably and there's commercial sense, and
mm,
anything anywhere there's a commercial reason that'll always advance quite quick. Regulators do have a tough job to try catch up. So I think
mm,
this EU AI Act is going to catch up. It's very far-reaching, broad brush, and I guess they're trying to future-proof it as much as possible
mm,
because they can't react that quick to changes. So they're trying to come up
mm.
with the most broad brush, future-proof. But the result of that is it encompasses a lot.
Yeah. So do you think there a sense that the regulation could potentially constrain some of these use cases
Mm,
in the future? I mean, because we come up with all these great ideas. I mean, you look at, for example, elsewhere where they've got like social scores, an example, which are definitely prohibited. I mean,
mm,
they're prohibited, explicitly prohibited in the EU AI Act. But I mean, so social scores. I mean, it's an idea, and so it's almost like you can come up with all these great ideas, all these great use cases, but do you think that it's going to constrain the regulation is going to constrain, maybe rightly constrain, but the development of the sector?
So I would think, in my opinion, it is going to constrain the volume of
Mm,
developments and the volume of I'm not going to say innovation, just the volume of use cases and different permutations
mm,
that are going to be developed. Is that a bad thing? No, I do feel though that the quality of the innovation will still flourish and will still thrive.
mm,
And so I find the Regulation Act will probably, in a good way, or most of the time, filter out a lot of the
mm,
stuff that, as you say, there's a lot of these ideas out there. It can be done, but then if you ask the question, like, what problem is that solving, you'll find a lot of these use cases aren't really solving a problem. It's just been done
mm,
because it can. So I think the
yeah.
regulations will improve the quality. So anyone that has a good innovation that fits within the regulations and ticks all the boxes, but still comes through as a proper use case or a proper commercial case, will actually be
Mm,
a really good product at the end. So I do
yeah.
feel that we're going to get better quality and less volume.
And I suppose it needs to fit into the constraints of what society wants as well, rather than just it can be done because it needs to. It's kind of like, well, is there an end use case for society or for customers really? Which I suppose comes back to having good use cases even in business as well. Does it help the customer? Does it actually help the process rather than here's the technology, let's find something cool to do with it?
It is good. And listen, I would have a kind of a tech background myself, and it would always be that way orientated.
Mm,
And sometimes you get sort of caught up, and this is definitely in the software world where developers think
mm,
because they can build it, they do. But if you just
mm,
ask, well, what problem does that solve?
mm,
If you can strip it back down to that question, like why would I put a button there? What problem does that solve? If you can always ask yourself those type of questions along the way, I guess you'll quickly filter out
yeah.
the good from the bad.
Drilling down a little bit on machine learning, I mean, there's always that the split, I suppose, between supervised learning and unsupervised learning, and sort of like, so it's categorization that kind of happens. I mean, how do you sort of you know uh, how do you sort of see, particularly the unsupervised piece for you? Is that really an area for development? I mean, people always look to that as like, well, I'm just going to throw the data in and it's going to solve every problem. Whereas the supervised piece seems like, well, look, I've got actual use cases that I can actually go against, and I can actually use that to train my models. I mean, is that kind of, is there a split in terms of, suppose, in terms of use cases?
Mm. Certainly, I guess the split for me would be So if you have access to historic data or anything that you can train models up, then use it. Like it's use it because it'll for your use case it'll be give you more precise, more direct answers. So if it's there, if data is available and accessible, then definitely use it. Would be my approach as plan A. You tend to go to the sort of unsupervised stuff if you don't really have an option. If you don't have that historic data set or the use case just doesn't, it's brand new. There hasn't been any um, data to base any assumptions on. Then you go to that unsupervised. But you're right. The precision, the accuracy with what you're going to get if you take your categorization approach or use case, it's going to give you ballpark and it'll help you segment large volumes, but you're not going to get that sort of precision on every data point. So I guess for researchers, I would like to think in the academic institutes, if they could continue to try develop the unsupervised type approaches, so that they can become better and commercial companies then can start to make use. That would be a real good partnership.
Yeah, I mean, one of the challenges we have today, right, is just whether is historical data actually going to be predictive of the future, right? So in terms of like everything that's happened over the last sort of 3 years or so, I mean, and is it or even the time frame in which that can be predictive is sort of like narrowing down, it seems, as a little as well. So it's almost like are there techniques we can use to basically remodel faster to get to information faster? And I know you guys look at things like affordability, and you can look at various indicators in terms of like what happens here and here. Is that a signal for something that might happen down the road? I mean, are you sort of like time horizons for predictions are almost like narrowing down because of the quality of the data and the history that we've got?
Listen, I think you're spot on. Time horizons, you're right. Maybe every generation has said that, but it feels like there's been more major events happening in a quick succession of a couple of years. So you're right. You can't use the last 10, 15 years worth and thinking that the next 15 years is going to be the same. It shouldn't be disregarded though. Like there is a huge amount of, let's say, the historic data. Let's say take 20 years. That there's patterns in there in life goes on. If we maybe just, I'm thinking more in our own sector in terms of consumers and consumer affordability in the finance sector. There's a huge amount in there that will still propagate into the future. But that should now only form your kind of base layer of your future predictions. You then have an obligation, I think, as any sort of analyst to then layer on top of that the different scenario models of what could happen. And you can inflation and gradual creeps and things that maybe have seen before. You can layer that on top of some of that, but you do need to go to the extremes of what happens if there is a crisis event. So, and we've been through a couple of them in the past couple of years. So that all has to be layered on top to make your future predictions. And you can't just like take old data and just assume everything is going to be the same. But that's not to say you shouldn't use the old data. It needs to be there as your baseline, but then you have to build up and add on to that.
Yeah, so it sounds like you're going, and I know we had this conversation before around physics, but so we've both got a bit of a background, although yours is much more illustrious than mine, I have to say, in physics. But you sound like you're talking about waves there to a certain extent. So it's almost like you have the macro wave, right? And the world doesn't really change, right? So you always have this like long period wave of of decades even, right? And then over that, then you have the next wave, which is like of a shorter period, a higher frequency, and then you got the next wave and the next wave, and it's almost like each of these techniques allows us to basically almost like fine tune in these extra waves to give us more predictive in terms of what the overall piece looks like.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, as we know, of course, we've spoke before, but yeah, I've done a lot of work in the renewable energy sector, and in particular ocean renewable energy, and so then oceanography and modeling ocean waves has been a big part of my life. But there's something that fairly unpredictable. You have a base, you can have a good baseline, but then there's rogue waves, shock waves, all that kind of stuff that can just happen naturally in the ocean, not necessarily earthquake driven or anything like that there. But these rogue waves can develop. And so I spent like a decade probably modeling and figuring out techniques of how you can predict and model that type of stuff. And it's very much a time history type approach in terms of the march of time goes on, the next wave hits the shore, next wave hits the boat. And so, there is a lot of really good techniques in there already from those type of physical sectors, the physical
Mm.
sciences sectors, that I think can be applied into other industries. So like the finance sector, and that's exactly what we do. We bring a lot of these techniques that we've learned in other parts of life, but are applying them now into the finance world. And
Eh,
there's a lot of
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting, right? And so we talk about cycles, we talk about credit cycles or predictions of default as well. But then we also have shocks as well. So people have life shocks or there's economic shocks, and they always seem to come as a bit of a surprise. Do you think there's a sense around the? I mean, because this idea of the rogue wave, which for people don't, I mean, you have these huge waves that basically I think it's superposition of lots of different waves that are happening at the same time, but yeah, because we could almost like be in a rogue wave now economically
mm,
with all these factors happening at the same time. And so, I mean, is that a good analogy in terms of like trying to predict some of those shocks and shocks to the economy? Because it's almost like this black swan effect that is because like, well, we can't predict that, but maybe we can get a little way along the way. So, well, look, some of these things can happen when things are happening in conjunction.
no, exactly. So the first starting point, and the statistics and the science is well out there. Like I guess I
Mm,
specialize in a form of statistics called extreme value analysis, which is all about
mm,
these kind of rare events. It takes on a little, but you can assess all the possible things that could happen. You can then assign probabilities as to what's the likelihood of it happening. You can start to horizon forecast of the window that you would need to wait until you might see one of these events.
mm,
So you can get that's well understood, all the analysis behind that. And then I guess there's a decision to be made though, that is it a suitably low probability of happening that you're not going to plan for it,
mm,
but I think
yeah,
if the scenario, if the outcome, if the detrimental effect, if it can happen, and you then do a quick sort of risk assessment almost on, well, what's the detrimental effect if it happens? And things like economic shocks, I think there should always be a plan in place for if it does happen. And
mm,
so I guess that's what needs, I guess that's the missing link. Some people kind of go, oh, it's unlikely to happen, so I'm not going to think about it.
mm,
But I think you do need to plan for if it does happen. The statistics and the analysis out there will be able, like, we can analyze the probability when it could happen. But you do have to have that plan in place, because you're actually showing that it is possible for it to happen.
mm.
And so, yeah, I'd be a firm believer. Um, Economic shocks, they will happen again. They're going to happen again. I guess maybe every generation just thinks, I just hope it doesn't. I hope I don't have to go through it. And then maybe people like
Yeah.
just glasses always half full, perhaps. But I guess you have to be a bit of a realist. So yeah, like, and the techniques out there, with any data set and time series of data you can use, like there's the
Yeah.
past, your Monte Carlo simulations, extreme value analysis. There's well known stuff out there. You don't have to go into fancy AI or ML to be able to do this sort of stuff.
And what about, so you mentioned time series data there, which I suppose which is kind of what we're talking about. I mean, that seems like that's one of the challenges you often have, particularly in the collections and the recoveries world, is in the business world. It feels like sort of predicting if I pull this lever, it's going to have an effect instantly over here, right? So we're into almost like this and this idea around like if I affect something here, it might have an impact in 6 months' time or 9 months' time, and it's the combination of this particular driver plus this driver plus this driver. It becomes very complex very quickly. I
Mm.
mean, as it does in physical systems, but it feels like we sort of that's one of the areas we kind of struggle with, and it's quite fundamental, I think, to the collections process. Really, I mean, do you sort of see that in some of the analysis you're looking at? So, for example, if you're looking at income and expenditure, what's the relationship between sort of almost like small indicators today that could be indicative that this person might have a problem in 3 months down the road or 6 months down the road, and it's almost like that kind of prediction becomes kind of critical.
It does become critical, and you're right. I think in the finance sectors, I don't feel it's used well, either at all or not very well.
Hmm.
It is all about the big number. It's percentages difference, and as you say, behind that is the assumption that if I do change something now, it'll have an instant effect, and that
Hmm.
my balance will reduce to zero. But it's not. It's the causal effect. Like humans, we all live in an iterative. We're all marching through time, and our decision today to spend on something may
Hmm.
seem innocent at the time, but it'll accumulate. single decision today, if you buy something down the shop, if something then happens tomorrow, this, and I already spent my money the day before. Like they're not unrelated. There is this causal effect, as to, and things can then contrive in the negative way, and really build up for people and push them into money difficulties. So the time series, the time history analysis, I feel is absolutely critical, and that has to be introduced definitely into the finance world, and certainly in terms of debt and collections and affordability.
Yeah.
And I guess that's the approach we take. We do that is our kind of our starting point. We will only sort of start at that level of granularity, because that sort of pattern recognition can reveal an awful lot and explain what will happen. It's not just the big number of this much money went out of my account and this much money came in at the end of the month.
Yeah.
What happened, how you spent it in the days in that month is critical to knowing what's going to happen next.
And what's your approach into like how you think about how to sort of tease some of those? I mean, I call them micro indicators, but call them like tease some of these indicators out to say, well, look, this one here might be particularly indicative, and it's indicative in combination with X, Y, and Z. For example, you look at things like open banking at the moment, right? So the fact that I might have gone to the shop before I went to the before I went to the petrol station could be indicative of something different, right? So you get into all these kind of like complex scenarios. How do you think about that in terms of like trying to tease some of that stuff out and analyze it so it becomes representative and actionable?
Yeah, so I guess that is the challenge. It's make it actionable. It's all well and good having all this data, and I think as a society we've never been better at collecting data. But for the volume we're collecting, I don't think we're actually analysing or looking or using it to do good. So you're right. It's the pattern recognition and distilling that down into something that a decision maker or someone can actually action. That is key. But one example would be, and one thing that we always try to pick out from our analysis is the prioritization of money. How is someone prioritizing their spend? So you're right, and that is down to timing. If we have to analyze their either open banking data or we can examine their bank statements automatically through the sector we work in, and it's how they prioritize. If they have money, what have they prioritized, and the timing of when they spent it, what they spent it on, is indicative. That can be flagged as an actionable metric, and very often it's maybe it's not the person who's doing anything bad, but sometimes you're not thinking and you just impulse buy, impulse spend, and some people that will have different behavior between if they're falling into an element of distress, or they can see things aren't going great. Some people react different. Some people put the head in the sand, just pretend it's not happening, and actually then splurge and overspend on elaborate items. Men in particular are very bad at buying one big, very expensive item, brand new set of golf clubs, or something, one big purchase over the top.
I'm fed up. The golf clubs. That's it.
That's it. Life is too
The
stressful.
heck with it. I'm gonna get myself a new bike and a set of golf clubs and done.
And things like that. I guess we all like to think we're unique human beings, and no one. But we do, like as a society, we kind of cohort. There's a lot of us will have the same reaction and the same behavior as to how we react. So it probably wasn't maybe not the greatest scenario, but it is possible to pick out that sort of pattern, and prioritization of money, the slow bleed of small transactions is a classic. You're £2.50 for a coffee, but you're doing that 7 days a week. The cumulative build up, it's you don't notice it on a day-to-day basis, but if someone like ourselves holds a mirror up to you going, this is actually what you spent, and you've maybe a small mortgage payment and takeaway coffees throughout the year. So,
but I suppose it's also around change of behaviour and things like you might be buying coffee in a certain spot, and then it's changed and you go somewhere cheaper, or it stops or it becomes every other day. I mean, all of those can be indicators of like changes of behaviour. I suppose it's the piece that's difficult is what does that mean, and what does that mean? Is it just me changing my behaviour because I've moved to a different town, or I've got a different job, or something's happened, versus versus it actually being indicative of a greater underlying effect, such as financial stress or those kind of things. I mean that's where you come back to the supervised learning piece in terms of trying to pull some of that stuff out. Is it?
Yeah, correct. So and especially when you come to the time series analysis, if you have on your x-axis you have your time axis, and you have, I don't know, your income, your disposable income at the
Mm,
end, and it's just it can be this sort of regular heartbeat, um,
mm,
and then so that you will build up a sort of baseline pattern that by and large, week on week,
mm,
month on month, this is broadly how someone lives, and then so you can start to spot significant changes in that. And when patterns start to deviate from their sort of baseline pattern, you always have to have a little bit of life variance in there
mm,
naturally. Um, but you're right, that pattern behavior, and a change, as long as you understand, I guess for me, I always find our role in our company is understanding what happened. We're not to say if it's good or bad, or you know
mm,
what the action needs to be after that. That's maybe not our job. We're all about presenting the facts and the figures and the insights as to,
mm,
did something happen, and it happened, and
mm,
and the reasons and the correlations that built up to that.
mm,
And I guess that's maybe where we then sort of draw the line, going like, we've presented facts and figures, and again that goes in terms of transparency. Like, if you're a data driven, evidence based decision organization, you've automatically ticked regulation boxes, AI Act, Transparency
mm,
Act. Why did you make a decision? Well, here was the evidence we had at the time to make a decision, and you can back up, and you should be able to stand over every decision you make. And
mm,
like, in our sector with the FCA, consumer duty is a new obligation coming in, and it's not. There's a lot to it for firms, but the main thing is evidencing why you made a decision, and can you evidence that you done the right
mm,
analysis to make the right decision. So I
mm.
guess, as long as you take a data driven approach, by default you'll tick almost all those
Yeah.
boxes and
I,
requirements.
I suppose the amount of data we got is just expanding exponentially, it seems, doesn't it? So, I mean, a part of it is also like trying to find what is the signal within the noise as well, right?
Yeah,
So that phrase gets used, and I suppose I love just putting on the theme a little bit around sort of like wave analysis, Fourier analysis, because it does become like the crackly radio, right? Because you
mm,
have almost data. It's like, how do you actually tune into what so that signal's actually happening, and then you've got extra data within that itself to then find out, well, what's the frequencies within that particular signal that's coming out, to give you the pattern you're actually seeing. And it's quite interesting analogies around. I love the analogies around using like scientific or mathematical techniques, that can be used to look at some of these almost like adjacent type fields, really.
yeah. And I think that, I'd agree. I find, well, maybe coming from an engineering background and science background, a little bit biased, but I find the techniques used in those other sectors that,
Mm,
face value, financial services and oceanography, you would kind
mm,
of argue that there's no relationship there, but there actually is, in
mm,
terms of the techniques and that should be used, and very often a crossover, cross pollination coming in from a completely different sector, and
mm,
often in the physical sciences, bringing that into the business and financial world is probably just maybe sometimes the fresh thinking that is needed.
mm,
Yourself, if you operate in the one space too much, you get kind of blinkered off to what the possibilities or what someone else is doing in a different sector that could be
mm,
useful. So we've certainly found that, we've started to apply all those techniques from our different backgrounds. um and I don't, well, we looked around first, and I guess I didn't find it was being used very much before, so we thought,
mm.
let's try bring in some of this and see what can be revealed.
Cool. I mean, what are some of the things that the discussions you've been having across the industry in terms of, you know, areas that are changing or areas you think are going to change?
Yeah, I think, in our sector, obviously affordability and cost of living crisis is, for debt recovery, insolvency,
Mm,
loans, financial services is still always the hot topic. Hot topic, but like, what are they doing different about it? I guess, that's
mm,
some of the questions we're getting from firms going, well, what can we do different? They're,
mm,
I guess, are busy trying to manage the. We're already in it, so they're now
mm,
already trying to manage, the process of people that have kind of fallen foul to it already, and are really struggling. But it's going to continue, and it's going to continue for, unfortunately, a long number of months yet. So it's really this horizon scanning is maybe a way to do it, and it is that sort of scenario modeling. What if? So economists and all are predicting the inflation is going to go like this and the cost limit is going to be that. So what if scenario? But what if it got worse, or what if it was better?
If you look through it from a portfolio point of view, here are the signals that are out here that are saying, well, look, this I think might be a problem, and it might be hidden in your overall portfolio now, but it's such a clear signal to say that something here is going to happen, almost like a diagnostic test to say something actually going to happen, and almost like flagging that from a horizon scan point of view, and then I suppose being able to drill down to an actionable level to then be able to review those accounts, or to be able to help them actually take action and sort of mitigate risks as well.
Yeah, and I think for the firms, the insolvency and debt advice firms that we deal with, I guess they have such a high volume on their hands. They only have as much resource as they can. They can't talk one to one with everyone in their portfolio. So to being able to hyper accurately segment that portfolio, that this is the group of people most at risk, they will take action. The solution really in our industry, though, I still feel, is that human to human contact. It has to be like that. Can't go away. But if you can segment them, going, these are the people you definitely have to talk to, reach out. This has to be arm around the shoulder support. There is then hopefully a bigger percentage of the portfolio that are doing fine. They're coping. They're managing well. There's no risk signs just yet, or alerts flagging just yet. So if you can't get to everyone, this cohort will be okay for another while. And I guess that's that is one of the kind of main value adds that I think we're bringing to the firms that we work with. But I guess because we start from the granular level of the spending behavior and profile of that individual or that household, it is hyper accurate and hyper personalized to them.
Yeah, so being able to drill down to something that's very sort of meaningful. Yeah. That's quite an interesting way of using the maths techniques, because it's all scalable, or you can, or will be the reverse of scalable. You can use it to basically drill down to the lowest level, right?
Sure. Yeah, and I guess that's it. And the key is, so two elements to it. The collection of data is key. If I guess as a data scientist, if you don't have data to work with, then your skills it's hard to be employed. So collection of data is key, and collection of good accurate data is key. I think a lot of firms and a lot of software and tech houses are good at that and are collecting a lot of data, but it's not now the use. That's one thing, and that's a very important starting step. If you don't have that, there's nothing to talk about downstream. But I think everyone can do that pretty good now, but it's making use of it and making use of it on time, because it does have a shelf life. You need to analyze it, almost real time, hot off the press, because it's going to be different. The effects a couple of days later or a month later in someone's life, the life can be very, very different. So it has to be that instant, and so it's having the facility that you can set up, that you can drill down. This can be analysed in hopefully a fairly systematic and standardised way, again for the transparency of as to how you approach it. And then here are 3 to 5 actionable alerts or outcomes that has been spotted. And then the treatment plan of that, well, I guess that's specific to every use case. But very often in the debt recovery sector, the treatment plan is engagement with the consumer and the right type of engagement. I guess that's where the human element takes place, and that's what these firms are very good at.
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting topic. And if you say there's one area that we need to look next, I mean, what's coming next? Because it sounds like you're pretty far ahead in terms of like looking at some of these new techniques. But I mean, what do you think? Where should we be looking next? Particularly when we look forward into what could happen over the next year or so? I mean, are there areas which you think are going to be the next sort of like frontier of development in terms of data analysis?
In terms of data analysis, in terms of being applicable, so again, this is a disjoint. I find the research, there is like some wonderful bits of innovation and research being done, but they're still so conceptual. It's hard for a company or commercial entity or it's hard to bring it to life to the populace because it's still so kind of abstract. So maybe in terms of getting something actually applied into the sector to make it a reality, so that we can all live and touch and breathe it. I think for the finance sector and the debt recovery sector, they need to adopt much more of blockchain type technology. Like it's out there, it's well understood. It's been used in all sorts of different things. But funny, for some of the sectors, I think that could use it the most, like payments, collections, buying and selling of debt, buying and selling of, that's exactly what blockchain should be used for, and it's probably the one area that it's not really used. So that could be a thing I would like to see brought into, well, certainly our sector, and I think it's a real element for scope. The challenge is that's not really a technology challenge, because it's there, it's understood, it can be done. It's a stakeholder buy-in. It kind of works. Everyone has to buy into it. Every side of the equation, regulators, every player in an industry almost has to buy into it for it to actually work. And getting everyone to buy into it at the same time is the challenge. Technically, it's there. It's ready to go from a tech perspective. So I guess that could be one thing I would like to see. But hopefully, I would like to see that would go, because it's transparent. It's non-fungible tokens, but like it can't be interfered with. Payments that go through 4 levels of processing, passing from one entity to the next before the cycle is completed. It's just scope for error, scope for crime, scope for a lot of things to go wrong down a supply chain. Whereas if you have blockchain type tech, you can't interfere with it, which is beautiful.
Yeah, and I suppose the big opportunity there is like there's a big opportunity in terms of efficiency, isn't there? Because you don't have to go through all these handoffs and the quality check processes and those kind of things, because you can prove that that's the debt, as an example, or you can prove that that's the particular, the particular person they are, or whatever it is in terms of using blockchain. So there must be some sort of efficiency gain. But I suppose coming back to time series, the fact it's across multiple different entities makes it quite hard for us to think about, rather than something we just control ourselves.
Control yourself, it is in terms of how a sector and works and the interactions, and for some, I get, it does draw into question then what if one of your functions was just to pass things on, then it would supersede some and so not everyone would necessarily want it in place either. Tech can disrupt and can, although tech can just do the job of what was previously done by humans or by firms. But I guess that's the march of progress, that's the march of time. I guess tech is always going to go forward, it is always going to get better, and I guess we always just need to be adaptable and think, okay, that I no longer need to do that because tech is doing that for me, but what can I do? Like, everyone has good, valuable, transferable skill sets to do something better and contribute different ways.
Yeah, and the one thing you can say about humans is if we always find something new to do.
Yeah, well, that's the thing.
There's never a lack of things to do, unfortunately. But so yeah, the dreams of the 60s and 70s, where we would just sit back with robots sort of helping us make cups of tea and coffee, don't seem to have happened, unfortunately. So we seem to be busier than ever. So well, Ken, thanks very much for making the time. I really appreciate it. As ever, it's always good to chat about some of these the mathematical techniques and hear some of the things that you guys have been up to from an analytics point of view. So really appreciate it.
No, Chris, listen, thank you very much. Appreciate that. Good.